Very few films have had the impact on a particular genre to the extent accomplished by John Carpenter's Halloween. Anybody who has followed this channel over the years knows that I've made my fair share of videos about said film, and how much I appreciate its contribution to the horror genre and the art of film in general. Many of us know that this independent chiller, released in 1978, was a box office smash hit, grossing over $70 million worldwide on a budget of about $320,000, making it the single most successful independent film ever made until surpassed in 1999 by the Blair Witch Project. Beyond its commercial success is a legacy spanning several decades, shaping the direction for an entire generation of horror film, while still influencing the tropes of many newcomers. Then 30-year-old director John Carpenter crafted a movie that, on a minimal budget and shooting schedule, encapsulated the cinematic triumphs of 1970s film, a decade that many consider to be one of the strongest periods for films in America ever. Almost 40 years later, it is time to unmask the mystique of this film, stalk its thematic origins, and shape things into perspective. This is John Carpenter's Halloween. The Vietnam War needs almost no introduction. An entire generation of Americans stood polarized throughout most of the 1960s upon the country's fight against the Viet Cong in Southeast Asia. Not without reason, American pop culture mirrored the sentiment of many. Music, film, and other art forms channeled the social distress felt by a large percentage of the United States population as this bloody war churned on. When all was said and done, the US involvement had officially ended in 1975, and the damage was unquestionably felt. Nearly 60,000 American lives were lost in this bloody, brutal war that many people felt was undoubtedly lost in the end. Upon this debatable defeat, a new climate was in the horizon, a climate that many say was so well captured through the medium of film itself. The 1970s brought forth the dawn of the New Hollywood, as dubbed by many film scholars and historians. Upon the successes of 1960s primetime television, sitcoms, and mind-boggling anthologies like The Twilight Zone, Americans were more so gravitated to the weekly helping of quality home entertainment, rather than forking their money to overblown, studio-driven motion pictures of Hollywood much more. The late 60s birthed this American new wave of films, with notable hits like 1967's The Graduate, as early indicators of a different style of filmmaking, a sharp contrast to the lavish and expensive studio productions that had grown tiresome. The 70s capitalized on that even further. Upon the realization of the lost cause that was the Vietnam War, 1970s films were stern in their approach to steer away from the bleakness of war, with space exploration films and even their satires being prime escapes from the earthly woes all over the news. Toward the mid-70s, however, came a definitive shift in tone. After the definite end of the Vietnam War, Americans had moved on to a more optimistic approach in attitude and culture, or more escapist in general. According to the Oxford University Press, the majority of Americans neither wanted to talk or think about their country's longest and most debilitating war, the only war that the United States had ever lost. So ushered in a generation of filmmaking that's been proclaimed to have brought forth a new closeness to everyday life. This will be important to remember going further. Enter John Carpenter. Like many noted directors of this American new wave of film, the young John Carpenter entered the early 1970s as an educated film student, him coming from the prestigious USC School of Cinematic Arts. His first feature film production, Dark Star, released in 1974, has been characterized as an off-satire of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Made for an incredibly modest budget, Carpenter was able to show his prowess at a young age, though the film was not commercially successful. In 1976, however, his next film, Assault on Precinct 13, epitomized some of the best characteristics of 1970s exploitation film. Much less an escapist film than Dark Star, Assault on Precinct 13 was indicative of the more realistic storytelling that was starting to trend at the time. This means a lot of on-location shooting, familiar characters, and a sense of naturalism. According to John Belton's writing in American Cinema, American Culture, this represented a shift to less politically subversive themes in mainstream cinema, something that appealed to the 12 to 20-year-old demographic. While Assault on Precinct 13's exploitation style didn't perform well in the US, it garnered a fair share of praise overseas, giving the 28-year-old John Carpenter a little bit of street cred in the film business. The next deal he struck would be the deal that launched an illustrious career. After striking a deal with producer Irwin Yablans to make a horror film about a killer stalking babysitters in the Midwest, they needed some money. That's where executive producer Mustafa Akkad forked over $320,000 with which to make said film, which at the time was still a remarkably low budget. Yablans insisted the film be set on Halloween, and in fact, titled Halloween. Carpenter obliged, citing creative control as the most important part of his deal. The rest is history. Given the background, let's explore now why this film is so particularly effective and timeless. First of all, the opening titles immediately set the tone for the entirety of the film. The simplistic yet chilling musical score establishes the sense of something sinister lying beneath the comfy surface with which we are presented. The orange color of the titles also gives us that friendly yet properly distinct feeling of Halloween, affecting us on a visceral level. As the music picks up, the famed pumpkin appears. As quaint and familiar as it looks, this also immerses us in the mood of the holiday. As the camera slowly dollies in and the music becomes more dramatic, a more sinister underlying feeling comes along with the image of the pumpkin. These are all non-verbal and fully visual cues of the tone the movie is going to portray. Everything seems normal, but underneath the surface is an unsettling and dark mystery to unfold. We're then brought to 1963. Following the framework set by the film Peeping Tom, we enter the most elaborate shot of the film and the perfect first sequence to get the viewers involved. Accompanied by the musical score, this engages the viewer with every sight and sound that foreshadows trouble. These are all indicators of what's to come in the later scenes. The young Michael is unmasked, with no questions neither asked nor answered as to why he did such a thing. It really is a tale straight out of any one of our hometowns. And then we get our introduction to Dr. Loomis, which very much so implies that Michael is more than a man.
Are there any special instructions?
Just try to understand what we're dealing with here. Don't underestimate it.
All great dialogue and cinematography here, as Michael steals the wagon and we're off to Haddonfield. This is where some of the key scenes take place. From the second we're introduced to Haddonfield, Illinois, we're given the sense that this is very much like most of our own hometowns in every shape and form. Trees lined up and down the streets, the quaint homes, typical cars. Nothing is too lavish or underwhelming about this town, so many of us can immediately identify with it on a personal level. The smooth cinematography helps us comfortably loom through this lovely neighborhood with Laurie Strode as she walks to school. Everything is going just how we know it. The walk to school on every average day we remember. All the while, the music also instills this very homely feeling, while also assuring us that something doesn't bode well in the distance. As a matter of fact, this is the whole point of the opening act. Most of the opening act is very focused in what it's trying to accomplish. They're bringing us through the daily goings of high school teenagers in a small American town. Anybody can identify with this on a personal level. The locations and the nature of the conversations with the characters are all well crafted and laid out to establish a very false sense of security. These things may not seem so groundbreaking by today's standards, but again, this was released in 1978. This was very much in line with the psyche of the audience. Moving along with the carefree attitudes of post-war America, the characters in the film are exemplary personifications of that. Of course, let's start with Laurie. She's shown to be a bit of a conservative girl, more so focused on her education and self-respect, while still yearning for the pleasures of a plentiful social life. She has her priorities, but her temperament is what makes her who she is. She's disciplined in her habits and is organized, polite, and still affable. These qualities are what keep her alive throughout the film, because while she's as human as any one of us, it's her focus and lack of precariousness that keeps her out of deadly situations. Now, this may come from a more strict home life with her parents, or just an upbringing during the Vietnam years. With that said, let's look at the other characters. Annie and Linda are interesting because, again, they talk and act like real people. They're convincing in their conversations and mannerisms, even though they were played by actresses who were nearly 30 years old at the time. What Annie and Linda represent, however, is the free spirit of late 1970s young adults in post-war America. From what the Oxford Press told us, we can see that they are the embodiment of the shift in culture that took place after the Vietnam War. Therefore, their habits and attitudes are far more careless than that of Laurie. They're much more focused on smoking, drinking, and having sex than they are any kind of structured activity. These characters are about self-exploration and living freely and without a care, since the spirit of the country had shifted into that direction completely by then.
Totally.
These two young women aren't wrong for their actions, but are rather embodying a pleasure to live in the now and not worry about extraneous priorities. Now, let's briefly look at Dr. Loomis and Sheriff Brackett. Sheriff Brackett has that real dad-next-door feel to him. Actor Charles Cyphers did a great job in portraying the easygoing sheriff who has a resolved sense of security in his town. He's showing the complacent attitude of some Americans after their experience during the Vietnam years, now enjoying the peacetime going on in their country and his town. Loomis is a much different case. Loomis, a clearly older gentleman, an embodiment of the generation that has seen multiple wars, knowledgeable due to their age and experience. Although everything seems fine on the surface, Loomis's experience gives him the instinct to know better and know that evil is lingering through Haddonfield, ready to strike. This is how the dichotomy of Brackett and Loomis is established, with one character being skeptical, while the other character has learned from the past what is to come. With that said, everything story-wise is making sense and why everything occurs the way it does. So now, let's look into the aesthetics. The cinematography is arguably the best quality of the entire film. There's definitely many great things about this film, but had it not been shot well, there would probably be half the amount of effective scares as there are in this film. This was a breakthrough project for many people, and one of them being director of photography, Dean Cundey, who would go on to team up with Carpenter several times throughout the years. He would also go on to be the cinematographer for films like Back to the Future, Jurassic Park, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's important to know that with his approach to the cinematography, the look and feel of the film were accomplished and served as integral parts of what make the film scary. Firstly, the use of Panaglide was a huge bonus and allowed for many of the scenes in which we see from the killer's point of view. But with more credit to Cundey, we need to note the style in which they shot this film. A lot of great tracking shots and dolly movements are what help immerse us in the environment that's supposed to feel so familiar. This is something that is extremely well utilized throughout the entirety of the film. We're able to move freely and smoothly through these very familiar sets and locations, and this allows us to feel more of a part of the movie itself, very much adding to the realism that makes it so effective. Additionally, for many of the scenes, we have a singular take in which the camera moves around freely as the characters move or interact. This is where the Panaglide's usage really kicks in and gives us a feeling of being in the room with these characters. This might also be a credit to editing, but because we're getting a minimal amount of cuts in key scenes, the naturalist approach to this film is more effective. We don't see cuts in real life, and with the camera being used more freely, it keeps us in the same point of view and adjusts how we would adjust if we were witnessing the events directly in front of us. It's brilliantly accomplished, but that's not all. Another part of cinematography is light and setting up a shot, and for many of the more stationary shots that are set up, they look beautiful and are perfectly lit. Whether we need more light or less light in a scene, Dean Cundey did a masterful job in creating scenery of either comforting or deeply unsettling amounts of light. There's many examples throughout the film, but probably the most famous is the scene of Laurie leaning up against the wall, panicked because her friends are dead, as the shape suddenly emerges from an abyss of black. This scene was crafted to put forth the effect of when one's eyes adjust to the darkness, and is probably one of the most sophisticated shots in the film, full of beautiful shots. You can see why Cundey went on to have a fantastic career. Now, let's look at the musical score. I'm going to be brief on the music because what hasn't already been said about it, it's one of the most recognized movie scores in film history and is still played in neighborhoods across the country every Halloween. What I'll add to the narrative is that I feel it has some underlying degree of innocence to it. I mean that in the sense that it doesn't sound overproduced like the theme to something like Psycho does. It has this quality to it that is just entirely seamless and nonchalant. It has a cerebral effect on you when you hear it, and that's about as well as I can state my opinion on it. Nonetheless, it's another insanely strong quality to the film that enhances every emotion we need to feel. Going back to the setting, we're going to throw some credit to the film's production designer, Tommy Lee Wallace, who went on to direct the third film in the franchise, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. It is worth noting that with the minimal budget this film had, they had to make the best of what they had at their disposal. This called for a lot of on-location shooting, which plays to the benefit of the film ever so much. Wallace was also part of the location scout team, which landed the beautiful suburbs of South Pasadena and West Hollywood, California, which provided a surprisingly perfect encompassment of Middle America. Who would have thought? Along with the locations was the overall look of the film, which was again very grounded and based in the natural state of the real world. Cast members were told to bring their own wardrobes to set, the interior scenes were shot in real residences, and crew members' cars were used as cars in the film. Because of this, the audience is completely immersed in a natural, non-sensationalized world where people live within their means, dress in real and fashionable clothes at the time, and drive modest consumer-grade cars. This builds on the mystique the film thrives off of from the very beginning, naturalism, and from what I see, the production design characterizes that extraordinarily well. This will enhance every scare going forward, as this nefarious killer romps through houses that look very much like our own. I suppose now we can move on to the pièce de résistance and discuss the shape itself, Michael Myers. The defining figure for a generation of horror, Michael Myers, or the Shape, set the standard for the cinematic archetype of the masked killer, completely silent, slowly stalking his prey, and being seemingly invincible. These traits have been copied, ripped off, and rehashed hundreds of times in the decades since Halloween. However, nearly none of the copycats even come close to eliciting the same amount of fear as the Shatner mask-wearing murderer known as Michael Myers. It's been speculated that John Carpenter based the entity known as the Shape on a few different things. Firstly, an experience Carpenter has revealed in which he visited a psychiatric hospital only to be utterly irked by the sight of one of the patients he had come across, a young boy. Carpenter described his encounter as such. He had a real evil stare on his face. It was like looking at the devil. He was filled with hate, but he was mentally disturbed. It was frightening to see. Additionally, where Carpenter excelled even further with Myers being a physical manifestation of evil was in his ambiguity. This is all summed up perfectly by Loomis's story he tells to Brackett, directly inspired by Carpenter's encounter at a mental hospital. The vagueness and lack of a known motive behind the Shape's violent and murderous path is a purposefully omitted part of the story. There is no motivation behind the Shape, no emotion, and no method. Keep in mind that the Shape, or Michael Myers, has the physical appearance of an average 21-year-old man. He stands at a modest frame of about 5'10", 180 pounds, yet somehow takes down his victims with not even a shred of difficulty. This is most effectively conveyed when Bob is killed in the Wallace home, with his efforts to fight back rendered completely futile. This can play in perfectly with the post-war feelings of America in 1978. It is also a huge reason why this film terrified audiences upon its release. This is a complete disruption of a peacetime in America. Their comfort and carelessness is being used against them. I don't want to ramble on very long, so now I'll come to my concluding thoughts. John Carpenter's Halloween is one of the best horror films ever made, hands down. The success of the movie, however, cannot be attributed to only a couple aspects, but rather the confluence of all of them. This masterfully creates a very seamless, naturalistic world in post-war America that is then haunted by a physical manifestation of the boogeyman. The film encapsulates the psychology of a blossoming free spirit in 1970s American youth and desecrates it with a mysterious, invincible killer with no clear motive whatsoever. Whereas Jaws horrified us of the deep, blue ocean, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre mortified us of the disenfranchised wastelands, Halloween brought the fear to our own homes. The quiet, comfortable confines of Middle America were no longer a safe haven, and with a killer who appeared so human-like, they never could be, ever again.